Afternoon. Let's get started. Welcome to our Joel Silidker Memorial Lecture. It seems hard to believe it's been 5 years now since we've lost Joel. Seems like just yesterday he was walking through that door and taking a seat alongside us here in the audience. But Joel was a good friend, and I think all of us who know him considered him a friend. To know Joel, you couldn't have any other relationship or interaction with him than friendship. To know him was to love him. So I'm going to invite first Dr. Ravsky up for just a minute to say a couple words about Joel.
So it's almost 6 years, actually, but who's counting? I guess I do, because I count almost every day. You know, Joel, when I got here 37 years ago, Joel was a chief resident, I was a new attending, and Joel took me under his wing to tell me what the Yale way was and teach me what the Yale way was, so that I wouldn't be a clumsy new attending from New York in Connecticut. Joel became not only my friend, but my brother and uncle to my children, and he delivered my kids. So we had a special bond. It's befitting that this lecture in his name is a lecture on humanism in medicine. Joel made everybody feel good. Joel cared about everybody. On labor and delivery, he would walk around and give people hugs. He would bring chocolate donuts and coffee almost every weekend, even if he wasn't on call. To his patients, it's really amazing, because I see some of his patients, and they still talk of him every time I see them. And he taught me to tell patients what I was feeling about them. And so I walk out of every room and I tell patients that it's a privilege and an honor to take care of them, because that's what Joel taught me to do. And you have to see a patient's face light up when you say that to them. Sounds corny, but they really appreciate it. Joel cared about people, and as Dr. Taylor said, to know him was to be his friend. Everybody thought they were his best friend. So when I say he was my best friend, yeah, I guess he was yeah. So, but it's hard to believe that it's been this long. But he was the epitome of a humanist. Who loved his profession, who loved this institution, and who loved helping people. So it's a goal for all of us to strive for, and every year I look forward to this lecture, because it teaches me something about humanism in medicine. Thank you.
Thank you. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Adashi here to Yale to present the Silidker lecture. Dr. Adashi probably needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. Dr. Adashi attended medical school at Sackler, and he did his OB/GYN residency at Tufts, received REI training both at Hopkins and University of California, San Diego. More recently, also had graduate training at Harvard, where he got a master's degree in healthcare management. He served in numerous leadership capacities in our field. He's division director of REI in Maryland. He was OB/GYN chair in Utah, and more recently served as dean of the at Brown Medical School. He's published about 400 peer-reviewed papers, another 125 chapters, leading force originally in ovarian biology, and more recently in healthcare policy and ethics, hence some of the discussion you'll hear today. His awards are just too numerous to list. There are a couple pages of awards in his CV, but he's been a leader of several of our major societies, president of the Society for Gynecologic Investigation, been president of AGOS, and is a member of the National Academy of Medicine. So Dr. Adashi, please welcome, and we'll hear about the origins of the Belmont report, and you'll see how that relates to Joel's legacy.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies, gentlemen, friends, colleagues, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to have this opportunity to share with you the Joel Silidker, MD, Memorial Lecture on Humanism in Medicine. Humanism, as defined by the American Humanist Association, constitutes a secular philosophy that commits one to an ethical life of purpose. Dr. Silidker, whom we are honoring today, lived up to that definition in many more ways than one. I learned that he was an undergraduate of George Washington in 1974, who earned his medical degree in the same in 1979, at which point he relocated to Yale, wherein he commenced and successfully concluded his residency training in obstetrics and gynecology. Therein and thereafter, from every testimonial I have been provided, Dr. Silidker displayed consistent empathy, caring, personal warmth, and enduring kindness, all of which was affirmed for me today from what we've heard thus far. It truly does not get much better than that. The Belmont report appears to be an appropriate topic for a lecture on humanism in medicine, in that the Belmont report humanized clinical research, especially, of course, in the United States. And it did so by shifting the focus from the investigator to the research subject. It did so by shifting the ethos from investigator knows best to IRB adjudication. And it did so by shifting the ethics from the utilitarian variety to its deontologic counterpart, which is to say, it shifted a morality that is a functionality of outcome, wherein the risk is worth the insights gained, to a morality, the functionality of which is the ethical code, wherein the risk is not worth the insights gained. But we are getting ahead of ourselves a bit. What I really would like to spend most of my time on today is the notion that ethics and science need to shake hands. This pithy, indeed cogent quote is attributed to Richard Clark Cabot, MD, who served as the chair of the Department of Social Ethics at Harvard University. Dr. Cabot is little mentioned for one reason or another, but may well have been one of the forefathers of contemporary bioethics. The quote in question can in effect be found in the introduction to his 1933 book titled The Meaning of Right and Wrong. What Dr. Cabot undoubtedly sought to convey with the quote we just discussed was the reality that when science and ethics collide, the bioethics discipline must be called in with an eye towards adjudicating whatever tension or conflict may exist between the two. And if at all possible, to arrive at a moral right, if such can in fact be defined. And even better, to arrive at a moral code that we can all abide by and agree upon and live by. Turns out that efforts to come up with such a code date back to the turn of the 19th century. The first such code to make its appearance was known as the Prussian Directive and was first publicized in 1900. It was followed by the so-called Weimar Guidelines, which were published in 1931. Those guidelines were followed in turn by the now more familiar Nuremberg Code in 1947, now in the wake of the atrocities carried out by the Nazi regime both before and during the Second World War. The Nuremberg Code, in turn, was followed by the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, and in due course by the Belmont Report in 1978. The Prussian Directive, also known as Instructions for the Directors of Clinics, Outpatient Clinics, and Other Medical Facilities, was the product of the Kingdom of Prussia, then ruled by German Emperor and King Wilhelm II. Turned out that the directive was rather foundational and indeed foresighted. Amongst the principles it articulated was the principle of respect for persons, which is with us to this day as the leading principle of the Belmont Report. It also introduced the precept of informed consent as a binding legal construct, which, yet again, is a lasting notion that is with us very much to this day. Discussed at the time, but excluded from the final published directive, were other innovative principles such as beneficence, which to this day constitutes yet another principle of the Belmont Report, and the principle of justice, which likewise still occupies a leading space in the Belmont Report, as well as the precept of preclinical studies first. The notion that before one embarks on clinical trials, one should make every effort to exhaust the preclinical route, relying on established experimental models, all the way to the non-human primate, if possible. Which is not to say that animal experimentation is free in its entirety from any and all ethical conundrums. It is not. Nevertheless, where we stand today in our evolution as a people, it is still, in effect, the law of the land, and by that I mean the law of the FDA, that any clinical trials, when submitted for an investigation on new drug application, must be preceded by preclinical studies that are compelling enough to warrant the FDA to, in fact, approve the subsequent clinical trials. Perhaps the most important missive of the Prussian Directive was that respect for rights and morality is just as important as medical and scientific progress, a statement ascribed to Mr. von Bahr, who was a consultant to the Prussian minister. This was a completely new notion to the medical establishment of the day, which I'm sure you can imagine was still very much in a paternalistic mode and was very much still self-centered and quite assured of its moral rightness. And the fact of the matter is that the medical establishment of the day did not embrace these principles, and I'll have more to say about that a little bit later. The Weimar Guidelines, also known as the German Guidelines on Human Experimentation, were the product of the pre-Nazi Weimar Republic. They surpassed their Prussian directive predecessor by adding the principle of beneficence, this time to the published guidelines, and the precept of preclinical studies first, now in effect published in the guidelines, and the requirement of a detailed study protocol before any human experimentation is undertaken. Discussed in the course of establishing the Weimar Guidelines, but excluded from the final document, was the innovative notion in 1931 of institutional review boards, as well as an effort to distinguish between non-therapeutic and therapeutic research, a distinction we no longer wish to make or try not to, in that therapeutic research generally meant research that is conducted in the context of the clinical platform, absent IRB approval and or adjudication. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later. Their import notwithstanding, the Weimar Guidelines, not unlike the Prussian directive, as I alluded to earlier, were largely discounted by the medical establishment of the day on the grounds that abuses are rare and that investigators know best. Though technically in force through 1945, meaning on the books, the Weimar Guidelines, for all practical purposes, were relegated before too long to bearing silent witness to the indescribable atrocities of the Nazi era from 1933 to 1945, which is to say, they were obviously completely ignored. No attention was being paid, of course, to these guidelines. Which brings us to the Nuremberg Code, which was the product of the Nuremberg doctors' trial for crimes against humanity. The additions offered by the Nuremberg Code to earlier codes included the precept of scientifically qualified personnel, the right of research subjects to withdraw at any time in the course of the study, and the obligation of PIs to discontinue a study if warranted, which today would be embodied in the so-called Data Monitoring Committee, which is a regular feature in the context of randomized controlled trials. J. Katz, MD, the former Elizabeth K. Dollard Professor of Law, Medicine, and Psychiatry from this very university, and a distinguished scholar of human subject research, had the following to say about the Nuremberg Code. The judges, in the most uncompromising language, suggested that the tensions between progress in medical science and the inviolability of research subjects must be resolved in favor of respect for the person, his or her self-determination and autonomy. As you can see, the wind was gradually shifting away from the investigator towards the research subject, but it took a long time for everybody to feel in tune and in comfort with that notion. Which brings us to the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, which was the product of the World Medical Association. The general principles articulated by the Declaration of Helsinki are now well familiar to you. They included respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. In addition, however, this was probably the last time that a code attempted to wrestle with a distinction between therapeutic and non-therapeutic research. The therapeutic research, as I mentioned earlier, being research conducted as part of medical care, albeit absent IRB adjudication. In a way, this was again a leftover from a bygone era wherein physicians were in a position of enviable power, but wherein subjects were in one way or another diminished in stature or import. What one has to say about therapeutic research is that in hindsight, it may well have given rise to past calamities, such as the thalidomide affair. In fact, the Belmont report explicitly states that any research, therapeutic or non-therapeutic, should undergo review for the protection of human subjects. Probably the most charitable characterization we could afford therapeutic research is that it approximates what we call compassionate use. Although all of you know that, of course, compassionate use marches to a different drum and is controlled by a whole different set of regulations. Which brings us to the Belmont report in 1978 and to an important question. Why another code at this time? And perhaps an even more important question, why a US code? The answer to the latter question is twofold. First, at the time, there was still clear evidence for the persistence of unethical human subject research in the United States, and we will discuss some of those examples. No less importantly, there was no binding national ethical code at the time, since earlier codes, the ones we have mentioned thus far, were never widely embraced and or systematically followed. And so we were codeless in a way, and probably in need of one. The matter of unethical or questionably ethical studies was first brought to the fore in 1966 by Dr. Beecher, who was the chair of anesthesia at Harvard Medical School, and who published on the pages of the New England Journal of Medicine an article titled Ethics and Clinical Research, subtitles, Examples of Unethical or Questionably Ethical Studies. Specifically in that article, 23 examples of such documented studies was spelled out of 50 or so that the author alluded to were in his possession or came up in the course of his research. One such study, which was published in 1952 in the New England Journal of Medicine, involved 9 patients with advanced liver cirrhosis who were administered nitrogenous products without consent, with an eye towards precipitating an impending hepatic coma in the name of studying these very precipitants. In another study listed in Dr. Beecher's paper, which ended up making the pages of the New York Times on January the 21st, 1964, a study known as the Cancer Immunity Study, involved the injection of cancer cells into non-cancerous patients, which is to say cancer-free patients, without their consent during the experiments. The straw that ultimately, though, broke the camel's back was the so-called Tuskegee syphilis study, which came to our collective attention on July the 25th, 1972. The reporter who broke the story, Jean Heller, was with the Associated Press, but she had her article published on the front page of the New York Times. She herself was tipped off by a whistleblower in that by that time, the study was ongoing for 40 years. The Tuskegee syphilis studies, which, as I said, was 40 years to the day it was disclosed, was carried out by no other than our very own US Public Health Service, and involved 400 poor, disease-stricken Black men from Macon County, Alabama, who were deliberately left untreated for 40 years in the name of studying the natural history of the disease. This is despite the fact that penicillin, of course, became available in the 40s, and despite the fact that even prior to that time, other medications were available, albeit less effective and associated with more side effects, but it's not as if no therapy whatsoever was available even prior to that time. As I said, it was this study that essentially unglued everybody. The nation was stunned, as was Congress, and the impetus to take some action in every way dates back to this revelation. I might add, just in the way of closure, that modest restitution was eventually made to Tuskegee University, wherein a center was established for studying the ethics of human subject research. And a public apology was offered by President Clinton during his tenure to all the participants who were still alive, and of course, their kin. Congress swung into action. I'm only showing you here two examples of hearings that were conducted on this very matter. You can tell from the titles, Human Experimentation in one, Biomedical Research Ethics and the Protection of Human Research Subject, that this was a hot topic for about 2 years, right after the revelation that the Tuskegee experiment was underway. While many actors were involved, the guiding hand of a young version of Senator Edward Kennedy was all over this undertaking. And I think much of the credit for the ultimate passage of the relevant law should really be attributed to him. Finally, after 2 years of deliberations and hearings, Congress passed and President Nixon signed the National Research Act of 1974 on July the 12th, 1974, which works out to be just shy of a month from the day President Nixon, in effect, resigned. Title II of the law read, Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Part A of which read National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, establishment of a commission. In a word, Congress was determined to establish a commission that would deliberate the issue of human subject research and the ethics thereof, and make recommendations to the appropriate governmental agencies to ensure that going forward, a Tuskegee-like affair does not recur. In his instructions, if you will, to the commission, Senator Kennedy offered that the role of the commission was to find the critical balance required to satisfy society's demand for the advancement of knowledge, while abiding by its strictures to protect the dignity, privacy, and freedom of its individual members. The eternal tension we have discussed throughout this presentation thus far. On the one hand, the imperative of innovation, of making progress on medical and scientific issues on the one hand, but without sacrificing our humanity and those of the subjects, we end up participating in our investigation. The commission that was so established was going to be a federal commission unlike any other. No previous federal commission was convened heretofore to define the ethical moorings of public policy. In addition, no previous federal commission was obliged to conduct all of its deliberations in public, in this case, courtesy of yet another statute that was passed a year earlier. And lastly, no previous federal commission was granted so-called action forcing authority, in this case, on the Department of Health and Human Services. What that meant was that any recommendations issued by the commission, they were going to be binding on the Department of Health and Human Services. They were going to be published in the Federal Register, and then they were going to be incorporated into our collective federal regulations, which is essentially our administrative law. This assured that any report issued by the commission was not going to simply gather dust on somebody's shelf, but rather it was actually going to be implemented. And that was unique. I'm not sure it has happened since. It has certainly been critical to human subject research in the United States. The federal commission in question was also unique in yet another facet that is perhaps self-centered, but has to do with the fact that the chair of the commission was one of ours, if you will. And that was Kenneth J. Ryan, Kate Macy Ladd, and William Lambert Richardson Professor of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Medicine at Harvard Medical School. The way the law was written, the Secretary of Health and Human Services was to nominate 11 commissioners. On their first meeting, the commissioners were then to select their leader for the next 2 to 4 years. And they happened to have settled on Dr. Ryan. I had the privilege of speaking to most of the surviving members of the commission and to most of the surviving members of the staff. And I can say that I've heard nothing but the finest comments about Dr. Ryan and his leadership of the committee. The commissions met once a month in Washington, D.C. for 4 years, from 1974 to 1978. Staff, of course, was Washington-based, and they would carry out much of the work in between those meetings. On occasion, the commission would carry out site visits, for example, into prisons, because there was a special interest of the commission, research that involves prisoners, which is a discussion for another day. For the younger member of the audience who may not have heard about Dr. Ryan or may not have known about Dr. Ryan, I'll briefly mention the following. Dr. Ryan was double boarded in medicine and in obstetrics and gynecology. He carried out seminal work on placental aromatization, work that of course holds to this very day. He serves as chair of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Case Western Reserve University from 1961 to 1970, a responsibility he took on approximately 3 years after he concluded his second residency training program. He also served as chair of the Department of Reproductive Medicine at UCSD from 1970 to 1973, but spent most of his career as chair of the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Medicine at Harvard between 1973 and 1993. It's probably fair to say that during that time, Dr. Ryan was one of the leading figures in obstetrics and gynecology in the nation, if not the best known amongst quite a few other distinguished figures. The Belmont report, as it turns out, was the last of 11 reports issued by the Commission over the 4 years of its existence. It was 20 pages short, which may account in part for its staying power, in that most members of the IRB committees, whoever they may be, are at the very least advised to read or consult the Belmont report. And it was first released on September the 30th, 1978, which would make it 41 years old today. And last year we recognized its 40th anniversary. You might wonder what's in a name and why was it named this way? And the answer, as you can imagine, is rather prosaic. Turns out the report was named after a retreat that was held by the Commission at the so-called Belmont Estate, which is in Elkridge, Maryland, and at the time was under management by the Smithsonian Institution. That retreat took place between February the 13th and the 16th, 1976, and it is in the wake of that retreat that the report was written over time by staff, reviewed by commissioners, back and forth, and ultimately was released on September the 30th, 1978. The Belmont principles, in a way, we have already discussed, but in the interest of completeness, it is worth remembering that respect for persons always led the way, which meant that autonomy was important, and that a non-exculpatory, voluntary, informed consent should be obtained in each and every case, no exceptions made. That beneficence is an important concept that takes into account the risk-benefit ratio of the experiment in question. Just because it's important doesn't mean it should go forward if the risk is unreasonable, unwarranted, or uncalled for. And justice is, of course, the notion of being mindful of vulnerable populations, vulnerable subjects. That justice being, in that respect, both individual and social in nature. Perhaps the most noteworthy point about the Belmont report, it is that it is the only code, at least in the US, with true staying power. None of the previous codes have taken hold, and none of them are really relied upon in any meaningful way. And the question is why? The answer to that is twofold. First of all, the Commission didn't just write the Belmont report and the principles thereof. It also wrote a report on institutional review boards. In a sense, they put together the entire package. The principles on the one hand, and the regulations and the mechanisms that were necessary to implement them and to ensure that they are carried out. So that was critical right there and then. It was not an ephemeral document that is conceptual in nature. It was one that was accompanied by hard and fast rules as to how these principles are to be implemented. In addition, as you recall, the Commission was endowed with a rare action-forcing authority, which permitting the embedding of the recommendations of both the Belmont report and the IRB report into the Code of Federal Regulations, which in effect constitute our administrative law. This is now commonly referred to as the common rule because it is common to all governmental agencies that are within or actually without Health and Human Services, and it governs institutional review boards and thus make the oversight of human subject research possible in the United States. The common rule, understandably, has undergone multiple revisions at many points, a process that has not always been non-contentious. There are all kinds of assertions about whether or not it was wisely done or not. But if we take a broader view and just look at the big picture, I think there is much to be grateful for to just have these rules in place and be sure that human subject research in the United States is second to none in terms of its allegiance to the ethical principles. As we speak, that entire enterprise is overseen by the Office of Human Research Protections, or OHRP for short, a government agency under the aegis of the Department of Health and Human Services that was founded in 2000 after the dissolution of its predecessor, the Office of Protection from Research Risks. The head of OHRP, which currently is Dr. Jerry Menikoff, a physician and a lawyer, reports to the Assistant Secretary of Health, or ASH for short. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the close of this event, we would do well to reflect on the fact that we've now had the luxury of 40 years to be assured that the conduct of human subject research in the United States transpires under the principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. The kind of principles that evolved from all the way back to what we discussed at the outset, namely the Weimar Guidelines and the like. The parties we have to thank and recognize include, of course, those very crafters of the earlier codes upon which the Belmont report built. And in this particular case, since Congress is not the subject of many compliments these days, we would do well to remember that there was a time when Congress worked in a bipartisan fashion to solve problems. There were great debates, by the way, that we don't have time to go into today, although it's a story in its own right and it's fascinating in its own right, as to how they finally came to agree on the National Research Act. The process was complicated by some obscure example of fetal research, which complicated matters to no end. Not every side got what they wanted, but they compromised, and they moved on, and the results are self-evident. And so I think it is important to recognize that the construct of Congress and what it can accomplish if it operates optimally cannot be diminished or should not be diminished. And this is a fine example, I would like to think, of Congress in action. We likewise owe a debt of gratitude to the Commission itself. These are individuals who for 4 years traveled to Washington once a month. They gave of themselves generously. They may have had their expenses covered, but it surely was not a financial arrangement of any kind that they benefited from. This was a purely altruistic service to the nation that I think we ought to recognize and appreciate. Very few of these commissioners are at this point still with us. Those that are tended to be on the younger side at the time, and they are still around to share those stories. And then, of course, since that time, the innumerable PIs who have made this all work by watching the rules, complying with the rules, and working in a responsible fashion with their institutional IRB, and seeing to it that human subject research is done in a way that is humane, which is the subject of this presentation. And I believe that we can say so with some satisfaction. Thank you very much. I'd be pleased if there are any questions, and if there is time to entertain any questions, please.
Thank you so much, Larry. Very nice. One question, and perhaps your opinion, is that so nothing anymore since 1978. So,
right.
Would you think that there is a need for an update, perhaps including the additional issues that came up, such as the influence of pharmaceutical companies on doctors, conflict of interest disclosure, and stuff like that? Or, I mean, what's your thinking on updating the Belmont?
So I think you're right. I think nothing is good forever, and things do change. And yes, I think the Belmont report, whether or not it's due for a revision or whether we should let the report be and just create a supplement or a new document altogether, I think that's a debatable point. Many authorities have commented on that issue, Dr. Kaplan being one of them. And I tend to agree that no document can withstand scrutiny forever. Times do change, issues change. To some degree, the updates were accounted for, or at least we saw some appropriate adaptation to the changing times by way of revising the Common Rule. At the same time, the Common Rule introduces some new issues that are by no means universally popular or universally accepted, and probably deserve more deliberation along the lines of a commission. The reality is that we haven't had that thorough, deliberative approach taken advantage of for some time now. This administration, for example, has not renewed the National Bioethics Committee, which existed during the Obama administration until its conclusion and was chaired by President Gutmann from the University of Pennsylvania. We could use a National Bioethics Commission, or we could use a dedicated commission to this very issue. And there are a number of things that come to mind that would be beyond the scope of today's presentation, but what you're suggesting is hardly unheard of. In fact, it's been discussed and raised by many good authorities for good reason, simply because nothing has a lifetime warranty. Okay, well, thank you so much.